Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the 2015 Darwin College Lectures, which are on the broad theme of development. And welcome to everyone here in the Lady Mitchell Hall and everyone else, obviously, in the overflow halls. And also welcome to the many thousands of people who listen and watch these lectures later on because they are freely available on the web. Darwin College is 50 years old, founded as the first graduate college and moreover the first mixed college in the University of Cambridge. From a small beginning, we are now one of the larger colleges, encompassing every subject and with our alumni spread right around the world. So you might say we're a very successful example of academic development. Now this evening, the fourth lecture in the 30th series of these weekly Darwin College lectures is Professor Bruce Hood. He's a psychologist and a leader in the understanding of the development of cognitive thinking. After a Ph.D. On the very early visual experiences of infants, Bruce moved to MIT and then Harvard and is now the Professor of Developmental Psychology in Society and the Director of the Bristol Cognitive Development Centre that researches early childhood development. His research shows us all how we develop to perceive ourselves in the world and how we come to form theories. Now, even Darwin and Newton were infants once, and the child is in some ways the father of the man. How do minds develop? Bruce has published popular science books on the development of the mind, including The Self-Illusion, Why There Is No You Inside Your Head, a title that seems to defy Descartes. In 2011, he gave the Royal Institution Christmas lectures on Meet Your Brain, and in 2012, he designed the world's largest simultaneous memory experiment, now in the Guinness Book of World Records. Perhaps he'll tell us about that. Alexander Pope, following Socrates and the wisdom of Delphi, advised us to know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Bruce has taken that advice. So, to understand perhaps the most self-centered of all development questions, how we ourselves develop, I welcome Bruce Hood to speak on developing a sense of self. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. What could be more important to each and every one of us than to have a coherent sense of self? That compelling experience that we are somehow inside our bodies, the authors of our actions, initiating the movements, contemplating the thoughts, reviewing our histories, making plans for the future, all as an integrated, coherent individual. It is important because we know that for some people who experience disruption of their self through the effects of disease, the brain, damage to the brain, or the effects of drugs, can find life very difficult. Indeed, all of us can experience temporary episodes where our sense of self can be disrupted, and we do things which seem to be out of character. We say, I was out of my mind, or I wasn't myself, or it was the wine talking. But when you examine those excuses, clearly they're feeble. Wine doesn't talk. If you were out of your mind, where did you go? And if you weren't yourself, who was this demonic puppet master controlling your thoughts and actions? Clearly, these aberrations reveal the true nature of self, namely that we are a mixture, a multitude of competing urges and impulses and things that we're not aware of, and sometimes these are triggered by external events out in the world. We are not the integrated individual that we think we are. And that's why I've called it the self-illusion. Now, when I say something is illusion, I'm not denying that compelling experience that each and every one of you are having right now. That's a very real experience. What I mean by illusion is that what you're experiencing is not what it seems. Consider, for example, this very famous illusion, the Kanitsa square. You should be seeing this white square sitting above the four dark circles. But what's remarkable about this square, of course, is that it's not there at all. It's just an emergent property. the brain creates it to make sense of that particular pattern. But what's more remarkable is that I go into the back of your brain, to the visual processing areas. I could find circuitries of cells, and I could measure from them directly. And these cells would register to real squares out there in the world. But the very same cells also register to the hallucination that your brain creates. So as far as the brain's concerned, the difference between illusion and reality is not that different. Now you might say, oh, that's all very well. Those are illusions. They're tricks of the mind. That's why we find them so interesting. But consider the reality you're having at this present point in time. You are experiencing a very rich world of vision and color. You see me on the stage, and you can see my movements. And everything seems detailed and full of information. But in fact, a lot of it is being constructed by your brain, and there's certainly a lot of illusory processes going on. For example, you're only really processing the central portion of your visual field, which is about the size of your thumb at a couple of degrees of visual angle. The rest of it blurs, and at the periphery of your vision you have no color whatsoever. You've got two gaping holes which correspond to the blind spots, and yet your brain magically fills these in so that you're not even aware that there's any information missing. And every time you move your eyes, all the visual information is shut off in a process called saccadic suppression. It's to avoid the visual scene being smeared every time you look. And if you don't believe me, next time you look in a mirror, have a look at your left eye and then try and see your eye movements. See if you can look at your left eye and your right eye, and you can't see your own eye movements. You can see everyone else's, but not your own, because the brain shuts off this information. If you add it up, you're effectively blind for about 2 hours of every waking day. You'd never know it. So, even though the experience is compelling, we mustn't be fooled into thinking that it's the reality as such. So, I think our brain does a wonderful job of integrating information, and it processes this external world to make it coherent. It knits it together seamlessly so we don't notice all the gaps. But I think it's also doing the same for the internal world. And what I mean by the internal world is all those processes that are really at the heart of our actions and our thoughts. And I think the brain generates this character, the self, as a summary of the complexity of the output of the multitude of systems in order to keep track. It's a great way of keeping track of the real complexity of things which are really generating our thoughts and behaviors. I think also we interact with cells. We don't interact with multitudes of others. We treat others as individuals. And so we've evolved an amazing capacity to summarize this process. So I'm a developmental psychologist. Where does the sense of self come from? Well, I think a useful division you can make is that sense of self which is a stream of consciousness, which William James, the psychologist, called the I experience. But there's another type of self which is more familiar. When we say, tell me about yourself, you expect to hear a whole lot of information related to either experiences or attitudes or education. That's the sense of self which we call identity, that William James referred to as me. Now, I think the experience of I, the stream of consciousness, is probably present very early. I have no reason to doubt that babies don't have full consciousness. But what they're interpreting, of course, might be very different to that of an adult. However, the sense of personal identity, the me experience, that must be constructed as the child enters different phases of their lives and comes under the influence of all those different factors. So I think that this me experience must be changing radically. And I would submit that the sense of self doesn't just change in the individual. I think that sense of self has been changing in us as a species over the course of our evolution. This now brings me to this man. If it wasn't for the fact this was a Darwin lecture, I would still be talking about Darwin. Because for me, I think it's very gratifying as a psychologist that Darwin recognized the importance of psychology. And this is my own copy of On the Origin of Species. And if you turn to the last pages in his conclusion, he actually says, quote, if I can find it, "In the future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be securely based on the foundation already well laid out by Mr. Herbert Spencer, that of a necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." And what Darwin is saying there is that if you really want to know what makes humans tick, it's not enough to just think about their development and evolution as adaptations to to a physical environment, you must understand how their behaviors and thought processes have also been selected. And those environments are not just physical, they include social environments. Our social environment has undergone radical change. And I believe that it has gone a significant change quite recently. In fact, the last 20,000 years. I believe that our species has undergone a significant degree of domestication. Now, when you hear the word domestication, you usually think about the convenience of living in modern societies. But the word domestication has a much older origin. In fact, Darwin talked about domestication in The Origin of Species a lot. The book is, of course, based on his observations collected famously on his travels to the Galapagos, but he spent a lot of the time talking to plant and animal breeders about the process of domestication, whereby they were selecting the attributes that were desirable and propagating them in the offspring. And this gave him the mechanism, this gave him the insight to how diversity could emerge as adaptations to changing environments. So I think that we have been changing, and I think the environment which has undergone the most significant change is a social environment. And that happened fairly recently. This thesis I developed in my last book, The Domesticated Brain, and I start the book with a really odd factoid that you may not be aware of. If you look at the fossil record, and by the way, I'm wearing a good measure of evolution in fossils. If you look at the skull size, the brain capacity of the human species shrank significantly at the end of the last ice age by about 15%. That's about the size of a tennis ball, which is not a trivial amount of brain to lose. Now, why would that happen? Well, there are a number of possible reasons and factors, and they're not mutually exclusive. First of all, at the end of the last ice age, of course, the planet warmed up. But as Chris Stringer, the paleontologist, pointed out, there have been other climate changes throughout the course of our evolution which are not correlated with any change in brain reduction. There was a massive increase in the human population. We know this by the analysis of the variation you get in the mitochondrial DNA that tells us that suddenly the human population exploded. We also changed lifestyles. We moved from being hunter-gatherer to settling down into much larger communities. Now, humans, of course, have been living in societies prior to 20,000 years ago. There's all the evidence in the record that they were collective and cohabiting and had religions. But at 20,000 years ago, I think that suddenly this social environment needed a different type of psychology. It needed a different type of mind. It needed one that was conducive to living in groups, collaborating in a way which was much greater than ever previously needed. And I think we were selecting those individuals who had the attributes which were the most conducive to living in this new environment. So we were self-domesticating. Now, is there any evidence for this notion? Well, remarkably, it turns out that if you select for prosociality, you can change not only the psychology, but the physiology of the offspring. And this comes from the work of Dmitry Belyaev, the geneticist who was working in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And he took himself off to these fur farms where they were trapping and collecting these Siberian silver foxes. And what Belyaev did is he took those foxes who were the most passive when they were approached, and he selectively bred them together. And what Belyaev demonstrated was that within only a dozen or so generations, you could produce a completely domesticated silver fox. Now, I'm going to show you some video. You're going to see, first of all, a wild Siberian fox in the cage on this side here. And this animal, you'll see it cowering, you might hear it snarling, and you'll see its reaction when it's approached by the caregiver. It takes a brave person to do that. Now, the next example you're going to see is one of the offspring of the domestication program. Look how different they are. Looks like a puppy dog, doesn't it? And don't forget, dogs are domesticated wolves. Not only do they behave differently, they look differently, they got bushy tails, they have floppy ears, a feature that Darwin also noted in other domesticated animals. Their way of thinking is different. they're much more dependent. Domestication comes with a process known as juvenilization, so they take much longer to reach maturity, and they're much more dependent on caregivers. In fact, when some of them broke out of the farms and escaped into the wild, they came back very soon after because they couldn't survive by themselves. And people who study comparatively wild with domesticated animals find that the wild are much more independent, much more cunning, and can survive much more independently. Their physiologies are changed, their temperaments are changed, their fight and flight response is much different. And guess what? The brain is about 15% smaller as well, as indeed are the brains of other domesticated animals. So I think this has been happening to us. I think that I would speculate that maybe our childhood suddenly increased at the end of the last ice age, and now we had a brain which took much longer to reach maturity by encoding more and more information, which made it much more adaptive to living in social groups. This, by the way, is me. This is my brain. We did some studies a few years back, and this is a functional MRI image. Sorry, this is a structural MRI image showing you everything that I am, every experience I'm having, this conscious stream of awareness at this present point in time, plus all my memories are somehow encoded in this remarkable 3-pound lump of tissue. But of course, I didn't pop out of my mother's womb as Bruce. That would have been a bit strange. I had to become Bruce, didn't I? I had to become, as we all do, we have to become the persons or the individuals. And to do that, we have a remarkable capacity for storing vast amounts of information. Because of these remarkable networks, these are the neurons which sit in the outer 3 to 4 millimeter thick outer layer called the cortex. And these encode information as we experience things in the world. This is transduced into nerve impulses which traverse across these vast networks of cells. And when the cells are firing, they're changing their weighting. And in this way, we can take information from the outside world and we can encode it in patterns of brain firing. And what might surprise you is that babies are born almost with a full complement of neurons. They have just as many as adults, if not more, about 86 billion neurons. But what they don't have, and you can see it illustrated here, is all the connections that join them up. So this is the visual cortex at the back, and this is a section through it. And these little dark blobs here, I don't know why it's making a noise, are these are the cell bodies, these are the neurons. And what you can see that over the months, the connectivity is vastly increasing. Now, there are two processes driving this. First of all, the cells are being told by intrinsic mechanisms to just form lots and lots of connections. There's an exuberant overproduction of these connections. But whether these are maintained or not depends on experience, because if they're not firing in synchrony together, the cell connections are lost. So we say cells that fire together wire together, and if you don't use them, you lose them. And in this way, the brain becomes shaped by experience. So this is a process we call brain plasticity. And it turns out that experience tends to be critical for certain functions. The famous work by Hubel and Wiesel, their Nobel Prize-winning work, was demonstrating that if you raise animals in abnormal visual environments, you can produce permanent impairments that you cannot correct later on in life. So there's something critical about having a normal experience early on for this particular function. But we're increasingly beginning to understand that what is true of the sensory systems of vision is also true of the social systems. The human brain has many dedicated circuits which seem to be specialized for firing towards socially relevant jobs. These are just some of the areas that I've put up with them. So we have the lateral fusiform gyrus, for example. These areas are to do with face processing. We have areas which register movement. The other next two areas are more anterior frontal areas to do with mentalizing. This is what happens when you try to imagine what somebody else might be thinking. Then you have regions in the more temporal lobes, which are the emotional areas, which are registering those positive and negative things that we feel during social relationships. And the last two I've mentioned there are areas which seem to be resonating when we're watching people do things. It's our ability to mimic and synchronize and interact with them. These are the sort of mirroring systems that have been of great interest. Now, they're all present to some degree, but undergo increased developmental change with experience. Our brain, I think, could be considered a social brain. And I know Nick Humphreys is in the audience, and hopefully he'll recognize that these are some of his ideas. We've developed a capacity to think and interact with each other, which enables us to live in complex social environments in a way which I think is really unparalleled. if you look at it, we actually have proportionally the longest childhood of any species on the planet. And we spend a lot of our time investing our efforts in raising our children. This is something you find in other social animals as well. And also those animals tend to be the more intelligent, but I don't think we're using those periods of time to instruct them or educate them. I think that education is probably a fairly recent invention. Rather, I think the long childhoods enable us to become enculturated, to learn how to behave. And if you think about it, that's what we tell children all the time, behave yourself. I think they're learning the rules of how to behave so that they can benefit from society, so they can go on to have their own children and learn from the collective group. And it turns out that this ability to become enculturated requires early social engagement, social interactions. We know this from the work of Harry Harlow. On the side here, we see some of his infamous studies of raising rhesus monkeys in total isolation. And what he was interested in is what happens if you give them everything but the social interaction. So he gave them the water and the warmth and the food, but they had no social interaction. He discovered that if these monkeys spend longer than 6 months without any social interactions, then they are permanently impaired in social behavior. When they're reintegrated back to the troop, they're ostracized. If the monkey is reintroduced within 6 months, then they can be fully rehabilitated. So there's a critical period for social interaction in the rhesus monkeys that Harlow demonstrated. Now, you can't do those sorts of experiments ethically, obviously, with humans, but there are examples where we've seen the effects of abnormal, impoverished social environments. And this, of course, is the discovery of these terrible situation in Romania. When the West descended on Romania in 1990, when Ceausescu's regime had fallen, it discovered that he'd been forcing women to have children they couldn't possibly look after. And so they were dumping them in these orphanages. Very often there were 40 children being looked after by just one caregiver. They didn't have any social interactions whatsoever. So many of these children were taken and fostered out to homes in the West, in America, in Canada, and in the UK. And in the UK, we had Sir Michael Rutter, the famous psychiatrist, study a group of them. So he took 111 of these children, and then he compared them to other British adoptee children who hadn't had that early abnormal environment, and to compare how they progressed over the next 4 years, 11 years. Now these children are now adults in their 20s, in late 20s. And what he discovered was, despite the initial really significant difference when you compare them on their IQs and other measures, they made up a lot of ground. So that's the first good news. There was a lot of recovery even in these terrible situations. But that improvement was dependent on the extent of how long they had been in the orphanage. Now, he did the correct analysis checking for malnutrition, and it wasn't the malnutrition or the physical state which was the predictor of the child's outcome. It was simply the amount of time they had been isolated. Now, here's the really surprising fact. It turned out that critical period was also 6 months. So just like the rhesus monkeys, there seems to be something really important about forming stable relationships really early on that have profound consequences much later down the road. Now, these are older children have, again, are now part of our culture, but they still have a legacy of problems. Most of them find it difficult to form social relationships. They have a lot of the behavioral problems that we associate with antisocial behavior. So what's going on here? Well, I think the evidence is strongly pointing to the fact that their reactivity to stress has been disrupted. We have a system called the fight-flight response, which is controlled by this sort of hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal system, or the HPA. Now, this system is activated when you have to respond to a potential threat. What I think is going on in this early developmental phase is that they're not developing regulatory systems. They're developing abnormal responses because they cannot predict what's going to happen next. And I think that's one of the characteristics of abnormal, social, abusive early environments. They're not necessarily aggressive. There might just be neglect. And in those situations, children are failing to regulate. And this is supported by the studies of animals in which you can induce abnormality, not only in vitro, but also in the early days, postnatally. If you induce stress, then their HPA system is knocked out. A recent study of Dutch pensioners now, who were evacuated during the war also have disrupted, altered HPA sensitivities, and the system is attenuated in domesticated animals. They're just a little bit more placid and everything. So everything is suggesting that this might be a mechanism which has somehow been disrupted by these early experiences. So that's the abnormal situation. Let's now turn to social development in the typical child. Well, we're born to be sociable. Mike Tomasello said that, fish are born expecting water, humans are born expecting culture. I think he's captured that beautifully. And when you look at the very young babies, there's lots of evidence that they're pre-adapted in many ways. So they have preferences for faces right from the very beginning. Studies in newborns show this. They prefer the human voice, they prefer their mother's features as well. So they're learning and preferring these early social indications. They have social interactions. They will share joint attention. They'll look at the eyes of the adult. They'll copy their movements. They'll share the laughter. These are all easily triggered within the first months of life. And then, of course, they start to pay attention to adults. And the adults they like the best are the ones which appear to be paying most attention to them. And the way they figure that out is because they're synchronized. So they show what we call continuity, or they're contingent. So if a child makes a response and the baby and the adult responds contingently, then the child prefers that adult as opposed to another adult who doesn't pay them any attention. And so I think what the infants are doing is they're trying to figure out who's most interested in them. And of course, when they start to become more independent, they will initially offer help and assistance to adults as well. So I'm going to show you some examples of these behaviors to illustrate some of the points. This is a famous video off YouTube showing imitation. Now, normally we think about imitation in very young children, very young infants, and it's often been thought that imitation must be a mechanism of learning by observation. And often when people study animals, they look for evidence of imitation about, if they can copy tool use. I don't think that's why we have imitation. I think imitation has a totally different function, as I hope you'll appreciate. So I want you to watch this famous example. These are, I think they must be about 10 months old as far as I can work out. They're twin boys. And in the background, the father has just sneezed. Now I want you to notice how the babies respond, but more importantly, I want you to take note of your own reaction.
It's my boy. Oh, bless you. Where's the baby? Oh, bless you.
Okay, so I don't think there's any functional significance to learn how to sneeze. I think what they're doing is they're clowning around. And they're trying to get, and did you know how endearing it is? It's funny, isn't it? And of course, this is their strategy. They're tugging at our heartstrings by making us feel emotionally committed and bonded to them. So I think that's the real role of imitation. They say that imitation is the most serious form of flattery. I think that these little guys are deliberately imitating in order to trigger in us a bonding social response. Now, not only do they start to pay attention to which adults are responding to their clowning around, they want to know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And this is a work which originated with my colleagues Paul Bloom and Karen Wynn. This is one of their former graduate students, Kylie Hamlin's work, where she's been looking at, if you'd like, the buds of morality, as it were. And she does these sort of morality plays where she shows babies puppets which are either behaving pro-socially or anti-socially. So in the first film, what you'll see is a hand puppet trying to retrieve some object out of a box. Okay, so it's attempting to open the box. And then along comes this gray hand puppet. To help. Okay, so that's a helpful one. They then see another version of the morality play where, again, the puppet dog is trying to retrieve the object. But this time, the orange hand puppet in this case is decidedly unhelpful. Okay, Okay? Now, having just witnessed these two characters, they're then offered the opportunity to interact and choose which one of the dolls that they like the most. And what Kylie has established is that before the age of 1 year, they will quite happily and preferentially choose the one that they've seen to be helpful. Okay? And what's true of hand puppets is also true of humans. When they see adults behaving either pro-socially or anti-socially, they also have preferences towards the one which they think is going to be most helpful. And also, when babies now start to become more motorically capable themselves, more competent, if we like, they start to initiate activities to engage the pro-social behavior of others. This is the work of Felix Warneken and Mike Tomasello.
Oh. Oh.
I almost heard a round of applause about to start there. That's not really, it's for the child. You see, what I think children are doing is they're being strategic here, okay? I think they're engaging behaviors deliberately to engender prosociality and our responses back to them. And so they're seeking out those adults who are most likely to be committed to looking after them. Now, you might just think, well, they're promiscuously altruistic, they're just good to everyone. But very soon afterwards, children show a sort of darker side to their nature because they start to show what we call in psychology in-group preferences and out-group biases or prejudices. Because when they identify with others, they start to share the resources with them, but if they see someone as an out-group, then they're decidedly very antisocial towards them. So to do that, to become an in-group or an out-group, you've got to have a sense of which group do you belong to. In other words, you have to begin to understand your own self and your own self-identity. And that has different developmental milestones over the years. This, by the way, is my daughter when she was 3. This is Esme. And Esme here is demonstrating at around about 3 years of age, passing a very famous test called the self-recognition mirror test, or the Rouge test. And this was developed by Gordon Gallup following the observations of Darwin. Darwin had noted that animals in London Zoo, when they presented with their reflection, would often attack the reflection as if it was another animal. So Gallup decided to develop this technique where he would put rouge or makeup on the nose of the animal when they were asleep, and then present with a mirror to see how they responded. And what he found was that certain animals would react as if it was another animal, and others reacted and realized it was their own nose. So typically animals which live in social groups, such as elephants and dolphins, pass the Rouge test. Now, if you try this with babies, humans, they generally will not pass the Rouge test until about 18 months of age. But below that, they just think the reflection is another baby and laugh at it. But around about 18 months of age, they'll stop and they'll remove it off. So self-recognition is an important milestone. I also think the beginnings of self-recognition coincide with another really interesting phenomenon known as infantile amnesia. If I was to ask all of you, and indeed the whole general population, what's the earliest memory you can have, most people have no memory of events in their lives before their second or third birthday. I mean, there's always a few nutcases who think they can remember being born. But for most of us, aside from those outliers, statistically, it just seems to be this strange period where everything is just a blur. If there is anything, they're typically fragmented sensory memories, no coherence as such. Now, it used to be thought that this is because you can't form long-term memories, and indeed the long-term memory structures of the hippocampus undergo change, but increasingly we're beginning to think it might be the fact that you don't have a sense of self at this age. And until you have a sense of self, you can't integrate experiences into a meaningful narrative. And that's what memories are, they're stories. So if you don't have a sense of who you are, it's very hard to form those into a sensible, meaningful event. Now, if you look at cultures where they talk to their children and review the day's events and encode them and include them in the storytelling, it turns out that they grew up to have earlier autobiographical memories. So I think the sense of self is really important in forming a sense of identity as well. One of the most important points about identity, one of the first things we get fixated on is a boy or is a girl. In fact, before they're born, we're becoming obsessed. Are you having a boy or are you having a girl? And parents themselves will either paint the nursery blue or pink or start buying gender-appropriate clothes. And this notion of gender identity is something that children become really quite obsessed with. because they start to look out for all the examples for the gender which they believe they're supposed to belong to. So they're gender detectives. But not only are they gender detectives, they become gender police. They start to say things like boys can't wear pink, or can't have long hair, or can't wear dresses. And they try to enforce this to strengthen this in-group and out-group identity. Egocentrism. This is another important thing you have to come. This work comes from Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss child psychologist. And he noted that children have a very egocentric view of the world. They think that everyone thinks just the same things as they do, sees the world just the same way they do. And I think that egocentrism is really funny and explains some peculiar behaviors. So, for example, there's a website called Children Who Suck at Hide and Seek. And if you go on it, you find parents have posted pictures of children attempting to hide. And as you can see, their attempts to hide are really quite lame. I'll just put them up. Okay. And this last one is a little bit ominous. And the children are failing because they think if they can't see you, you can't see them. So it's a failure to take another person's perspective. And without that capacity to take another person's perspective, of course, social interactions are going to be fairly limited. Okay. So you have to understand that other people see the world differently from you. The next, well, it's not the next, but one of the next major milestones is developing what psychologists call a theory of mind. And this is the capacity to understand that not only do people have minds, but they may think things are different, or they might hold a different view, or they might hold what we call a false belief. And I'll explain that in a moment. A typical false belief task would be if I was to ask every one of you what's in the box, hopefully you would say, well, I think there's Smarties in there. And then if I open up and show you that it contains pencils, you think, well, that's a bit lame, but okay. And I said, well, what did you think was in there first of all? You said, well, I thought there were Smarties in there. And what do you think is in there now? Well, there's pencils. And what do you think that your friend will think is in there? Well, they'll think there's Smarties. That's the sort of mature response. You understand that people can also be fooled. But 3-year-olds, if you present that task to them, will typically say, well, there's Smarties in there. And then if you show them pencils, and you say, what did you think was in there? They say, well, there were pencils in there. And what do you think your friend will think is in there? They say, well, they'll think there's pencils in there as well. So they fail to understand the false belief that people can be mistaken. Another classic example, and I'm going to show a video from Charlie Lewis, is the Sally Ann task. And this is where you use deception to induce a false belief in others.
This is Sally, and this is Anne. All right? Now, Sally comes in with her marble. Sally puts her marble into the basket and goes out. All right, she's out now, isn't she? Anne comes and gets the marble, and she puts the marble in the box. Here comes Sally. Here comes Sally. Now, where will Sally look for the marble? You got it for her! Hooray!
Now, that is the typical 3-year-old response. At 4 years, they get it. And of course, some children never get it. Those are individuals who typically will have autism-type conditions. And you can understand why your inability to understand another person's mental state would be a real impairment in social interactions. If you don't know where another person's coming from, if you cannot appreciate that they may be operating with a false belief, that makes social interactions very difficult. Moreover, with a theory of mind, of course, you can deliberately be Machiavellian. You can deliberately deceive others. So you can understand why understanding false beliefs and theory of mind would be important for social interactions. The next sort of thing that you really start to worry about is when you understand that people have minds and thoughts and opinions, children start to become obsessed with, well, what do they think about me? This is where self-esteem starts to become an important component of our self-construction. And indeed, it remains for us for the rest of our lives. I've been studying this in our lab. We've been looking at the use of ownership as a measure of self-esteem. And I'm building upon an observation by William James again. James had talked about the man's self being the sum total of not only what he can call his own, not only his body and his psychic powers, but also his clothes, his house, his wife, his children, his ancestors, his friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank account. It's a bit misogynist, but I take it, what he's saying is that we use objects in the West to signal our status, and we covet objects of value because this gives us a sense of self-worth and self-esteem. And this is what you find in children. Children will also covet objects that they think the rest of the children want as well. And in fact, they become incredibly materialistic. They're really selfish. Getting children to share is not that easy. They won't share resources until 6 or 7 years of age spontaneously. Up until that point in time, they're incredibly selfish. And so you have to be able to share resources as becoming part of pro-sociality, understanding who you can share your resources with, who are the in-groups and who are the out-groups. And finally, self-control. I'd like to say a little bit about that. As you saw in that last child who rushed to show you where the marble was, she may lack a false belief, but what's probably also going on in these sorts of tasks is that they're so impulsive, and because they can't stop themselves knowing something to be true. And so one of the real changes, certainly in the toddler period between 3 and 4 years of age, is the capacity for self-regulation. Now, if you cannot regulate and control your own behaviors, then that can make social interactions very difficult. Now, this has been studied in a number of labs. I'm going to show it since this is a very famous example. This is Walter Mischel's marshmallow test. Now, what Mischel demonstrated is that, first of all, children have a problem with self-control. But I'm going to show you some video of older children passing his task. In this task, they've been told, don't eat the marshmallow, or if you delay the gratification of eating the marshmallow, you can have 2 when the experimenter comes back into the room. And what this comical video shows, the sort of strategies or techniques the children employ to avoid that temptation. So those children are passing on the delayed gratification, but you can see they need to exert a lot of effort and distractions to take their mind off the goal. Now, what Mischel has demonstrated in his original studies, he showed that their capacity, the length of time they could delay gratification, predicts how well they do at school 11 years later, how well adjusted they are as adults, whether they even become drug addicts as adults later in life. But it also predicts their social behavior, how many friends they have, and also how stable they are in their emotional relationships. And so the argument is that the mechanism is that when you're engaged in social relationships, it really is a bit of give and take, isn't it? And so we all know people who are really so egocentric or so impulsive that cannot regulate their own behavior. So you have to learn to control your own urges and impulses in order to have satisfying and productive social interactions. So these are all components of social development. They're integrated by many systems. We have the frontal lobes, which are partly to do with inhibiting behaviors, enabling us to plan, enabling us to mentalize. My point is the brain is a multitude of systems which are coordinated and integrated to produce this sense of self. We feel that we are the ones in control, but of course we're being pulled by the marshmallow, and we're being pulled by the in-groups. So there are lots of things which are driving the system. And yet we feel we are inside our head like a little puppet master. Paul Bloom, my colleague, says we don't just feel different to our bodies, we occupy them, we possess them, we own them, like this sophisticated machine that we're driving. But even though that is a compelling experience, for example, if you ask people to imagine where their present seat of consciousness is at this present point in time, if you ask them to shut their eyes and to point to where they feel the origin of their consciousness is coming from, they don't point to their buttocks or their feet. They point to their head, and they feel they're somewhere behind their eyes. Now, I would imagine most of you have that kind of experience now. This is a study plotting where people think they are, but they can't be there. There can't be a little you driving the machine. Because I think some of you already spotted the problem, because if there's a little you inside your head, then who's inside their head, and their head, and their head, and so on. So you get to an infinite regress. So it can't be like that. It's more like this. This is the numbskulls. Now, this little character we call in philosophy the homunculus. I'm not suggesting there's lots of little homunculi inside your head, but we do have lots of parallel autonomous systems, the output of which is somehow brought together to produce this unified experience that we call the self. The brain is a massively parallel system, integrating the information from all over. These are some of the major pathways. This is some of the latest imaging technique I'd share with you. And we get this coherent sense of self. But if you disrupt these pathways, then you can see how the self can fractionate. Now, this is the work of Michael Gazzaniga with patients who have had a specific operation to disconnect the two halves of the brain, cutting through the bundle of fibers we call the corpus callosum, which generally shares information between the two halves. This is done to treat intractable epilepsy. But with these patients, what you can do is you can demonstrate how independent the different parts of the brain are. So, for example, in these studies, he shows them pictures on a computer screen, and there's words in the left visual field and words in the right. Now, normally, due to the way the anatomical connections cross over, all the information on the left side of the world is processed by the right hemisphere, and all the information and action responses on the right side of the world is processed by the left hemisphere. So if you ask them to say what you see on the screen, language speech production is typically in the left hemisphere, they will process and respond and say the word in the right field, which is, in this case, the word ring. But if you ask them to pick up the object with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, but doesn't have speech, but can still process words, then they pick up the key. Now, when they're presented with this inconsistencies, what Gazzaniga demonstrates is that people will confabulate a story to make sense of, or to reconcile the differences that they can now observe. And what Gazzaniga has argued is there's a system he calls the interpreter, which enables us to try and piece together all these inconsistencies to make sense of everything. But you don't have to have your brain split in two to show this effect. This is a study on what's called choice blindness. So in this study, these are normal participants. They're asked to make a choice. It works with tasting food or tasting drinks, or in this case, deciding which of two faces you prefer. So the study proceeds. You say, I prefer one face, and then you're given the face and you're explained to justify why you thought this person was better than the face you just rejected. But what they did in the study cleverly is that on some of the trials, having just made a choice, they surreptitiously switched the two faces and gave you the face that you had just rejected. And people would go on to give a perfectly lucid reason why this was a much better face than the one that they had just rejected. And what that suggests is that we often post-rationalize a lot of our events. We make sense of things. And this is why Steven Pinker says that consciousness isn't so much the captain control, it's more of a sort of spin doctor of experience. And I think he's right, that in many instances we're not attending to everything, we're just assuming continuity. And so I think that this is part of our need to keep a coherent sense of self, which explains probably one of the most famous phenomena in psychology, known as cognitive dissonance. And I've put up Aesop's fox here. Remember, the fox was trying to get the grapes and put a lot of effort to try and get them, couldn't reach the grapes, and they just gave up and walked away. He said, I didn't like them, I didn't want them anyway because they were sour. That's where we get the term sour grapes from. And this refers to this phenomenon that we've all done to some extent, where we put effort into trying to get a job, trying to secure a relationship, trying to do things, and when we're thwarted or we fail, rather than acknowledging that it might be our fault, we say, well, they were a jerk, I didn't want the job, or whatever. And that cognitive dissonance is where we reframe events to maintain a positive bias, a positive image of who we are, rather than deal with the fact that we're maybe not as good as we think we are. I also think that this mechanism to maintain a self-coherence can be found in many other famous examples from the realms of social psychology. For example, people think that they would be quite reliable and not be influenced by others. But we do know that if you have enough people in a room saying that black is white, then it's a lot of pressure to sort of disagree with them. So this is the work of Solomon Asch, showing that we will comply and conform with the group under a number of circumstances. This also, I think, explains the more infamous studies of Stanley Milgram, showing that people who would never believe they were capable of administering very dangerous shocks would do so if they believed that the other person is an authority figure telling them to do so. And this has been used by psychologists to explain the so-called atrocities, well, not so-called, the real atrocities, where people seem to act totally out of character or behave in a way they would never describe themselves capable of doing. Now, there's lots of controversies about these experiments, but I think the point is that most of us will behave in ways which seem to defy our representation of who we think we are as an integrated, coherent self. I just want to finally end talking about the new future, because 20,000 years ago, I've speculated was a major transition, but I think we're undergoing another transition of equal magnitude. As we take ourself and put ourself out on the internet, we now can communicate and interact with a multitude of often anonymous people in an instant, in real time, in a way which is totally unprecedented. And we're not even sure how this is going to change our interactions. But I think it's really interesting that we still have this essential nature to maintain a sense of self-esteem and self, and it doesn't matter how famous you are. We know that there's something like 7 billion likes every day. For those of you who are not on social networking, this is where we can rate our people that we follow, or people who are in our networks. We can give them thumbs up if we think their picture is good, and we seek this validation, which is really bizarre. But you might imagine that with all this capacity for interconnection, we would become more of a level playing field. All our attitudes and our sense of selves, we would become more homogenized. But paradoxically, this access to vast numbers might produce a different effect. You might actually get more radicalization, more extremism. So this is an analysis of retweeting on Twitter. Now, I'm going to assume some of you don't know what Twitter is, but Twitter is this very rapid way of exchanging very short messages with each other, and people who follow each other will typically retweet and pass their messages on to the people that follow them and so forth. So it's a sort of way of getting validation for your opinions and comments. This is an analysis of political tweets, these little short messages, during a campaign in America. And what they found was that rather than getting a level playing field, the messages that we tended to pass on were very partisan. And that doesn't seem too surprising, but you can see how, rather than becoming more level or democratic, actually people become more extreme in their positions. So there's enough crazy people on the internet. So rather than being ostracized, you can find enough people to agree with your position. So this is why the internet actually might enable radical groups to emerge and sustain themselves. I just want to finally sort of say that whilst we've done well, we've benefited from this incredible social environment that we've created, that we've evolved, and we've got the collective wisdom that's enabled us to build the technologies and exponential understanding of the world around us. The flip side of all this pro-social behavior are the consequences of what happens when you are ostracized. Ostracism is one of the worst things you can do. This was noted by Nelson Mandela in his autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom. He talked about the corrosive effects of ostracism in fellow prisoners who would prefer to be tortured rather than left in total isolation. And even himself, he said that he started to form conversations and social interactions with the insects. And this was, again, I think, captured dramatically in the film with Tom Hanks, Castaway, a story of a man, castaway on an island. He forms a social relationship with an inanimate object, this volleyball that he called Wilson. So it's so important for us that we would rather suffer physical pain than be left alone. And that when there's no one else around, we'll create them in this need to have social interaction. But it's not just a psychological problem. And I know you're not going to be able to see all the detail of this graph, but this was a recent study done 2 years ago, which is a meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is where you take lots and lots of studies together and you combine them together statistically to work out the strength of an effect. And in this study, what they were interested in, what are the negative consequences, the health consequences of living alone? And you can't read it, but these 3 bars on the top here, these are the effects of living alone, social isolation. And they are much more, as a health factor, they're much more likely to lead to earlier death, this is studying people over 7 years, than moderate smoking, drinking, and obesity. They pose a greater health risk. And given that at least 7 million of these people are living alone, then I think this is obviously a terrible ticking time bomb, if you like, for the problems of social isolation. So In the same way that the Koenitsa square isn't really there, but it is there because it emerges out of the context of everything around it, I think it's the same with the self. We emerge out of the context shaped over our development, shaped by the interactions that we have. All the experiences help to form us. But as you take those away, and maybe it's through the effects of isolation or through the effects of brain disorders where people lose their connections, you can see that sense of self eventually disappearing until it goes. Thank you.
Bruce, thank you very much indeed. You've given us a huge amount to think about. It's the illusion of self. Pope commented that a man is in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body to prefer. It's that little word I, and yet there's we in there. And how long is it going to take before, as humanity, we can, with honesty, really all use the word we, rather than that I getting in the way all the time? Some amazing imagery there and ideas, and I just wondered how well adjusted we all are. How would we all do? It's coming up for 7 o'clock. How would we do in that marshmallow test, or perhaps a glass of wine test, or a cup of coffee test? How long could we all hold out? I guess it's a good idea Bruce didn't actually test us. But thank you very much indeed.